everyone, Stacey and Cardiff here. This is The Indicator from Planet Money. Today is the first Jobs Friday of the year, but unfortunately, we are going to have to refrain from blasting the traditional celebratory Jobs Friday air horn because we did not get good news this morning.
There was no good news this morning.
No.
The Bureau of Labor Statistics released the jobs report for the month of December, and it showed that the economy lost 140,000 jobs. And this was the first month since last April that the economy has lost jobs, which means that the labor market's recovery, which was already slowing down, has actually gone into reverse because of the COVID resurgence throughout the country.
Now, not every part of the labor market has been equally damaged, and not every worker has been equally affected. And so for today's show, we have scoured through the details of the jobs report, and we are going to give you our 3 big takeaways from the report.
Our takeaways not just for what happened last month, but for all of last year, a year in which the economy lost more than 9 million jobs, making 2020 the single worst year of job losses since World War II. 2020, a year that a lot of us would maybe prefer not to remember, but a year that we will certainly never forget.
Okay, our 3 takeaways from the jobs report. First, when we look back over the last few months, more and more people who lost their jobs because of the pandemic are not getting rehired. And this has been one of the defining trends of the pandemic recently. We had all hoped that after the massive number of layoffs at the very beginning of the pandemic, those first couple of months, that employers would be able to rehire a lot of their workers as the economy recovered. And at first, that is what happened. But that progress obviously stalled out and has gone into reverse.
Back in February, before the pandemic really arrived in the U.S., roughly 1 million people had been unemployed for more than half a year. Now, there are close to 4 million people who are long-term unemployed. And here's another way to look at that. Out of everyone who is unemployed right now, more than 1 out of 3 of them have been unemployed for longer than half a year.
And this matters so much because the longer somebody is out of work, the harder it is for them to get a job again in the future. They start losing their contacts, their skills can get rusty, they become dejected, and businesses might increasingly become reluctant to hire them. So unless the labor market improves, their job loss increasingly starts to look permanent. And that also matters for the rest of the economy. Because if long-term unemployment keeps rising, that's also just a lot of people who are going to be afraid to spend any money in the economy. And that hurts businesses that are still going and the people that work for them as well.
Okay. So our second takeaway from this jobs report is that to understand what's happening in the labor market, you have to look at each economic sector individually, because the effects of this pandemic have been really uneven across the economy.
Arguably, the sector that has suffered the most has been leisure and hospitality. It includes jobs mainly in restaurants and bars and hotels, and also jobs in the arts, like jobs in the theater and in museums. The sector had been recovering some of its jobs, but in December, it started losing jobs again because of the pandemic's resurgence all across the U.S.
Since the pandemic started, almost 1 out of every 4 jobs in leisure and hospitality has been lost. That adds up to almost 4 million jobs. And a lot of those jobs, like jobs in restaurants and bars that have gone out of business, are gone forever, which means those workers will have to find new jobs when the economy recovers.
And to understand how big a deal this is, think about it this way. There are almost 10 million fewer jobs in the whole economy than before the COVID recession. 40% of all those disappearing jobs are accounted for just by the losses in this one single sector, leisure and hospitality.
As for parts of the economy that have actually been recovering, we can look at the manufacturing and construction sectors. Both of those sectors are now close to having recovered all of the jobs that they initially lost in the early months of the pandemic. And maybe just as importantly, there are signs that they will keep on growing, keep on recovering.
Yeah, the construction sector is obviously tied to the housing market. And the housing market has actually been booming for a couple of reasons. First, because mortgage rates are so low. And second, because there's just so much demand for houses and not many existing houses left that are available to buy, which means that builders will have to keep building more houses.
As for manufacturing, it's doing well because people are buying more stuff. more stuff to put in their houses where they're spending so much more time right now. In fact, the most recent survey of managers in the manufacturing sector shows that the manufacturing economy has grown for the 8th consecutive month. Remember, jobs in the manufacturing sector had mostly been falling for decades. But right now, at least, they're going up. That sector's looking pretty good.
Yeah, and the jobs gained in these sectors recently have obviously not been enough to offset the weakness in the rest of the labor market, but that's a silver lining that we still think people should know about.
I feel like we need some silver linings right now.
Yeah, why not? And finally, our third takeaway, looking back across all of 2020, it's just very clear how the labor market's collapse has intensified some of the inequalities that already existed going into the COVID recession. And we can see this just simply by looking at the different unemployment rates for different groups.
Yes. So, for example, different racial and ethnic groups. The unemployment rate throughout the pandemic has climbed more for Black and Hispanic Americans than it has for white Americans. The Black unemployment rate is close to 10% right now. And for Hispanic Americans, it is above 9%. The white unemployment rate is just 6%, which is still high, but lower than the overall unemployment rate.
And we can also look at educational status. College graduates, for example, who are much more likely to be able to keep doing their jobs from the safety of their homes, well, their unemployment rate is just 3.8%, really low. For high school graduates, though, the unemployment rate is more than twice as high. And for people who don't have a high school diploma, it's more than 2.5 times as high, close to 10%.
And there is also an incredible data point in this jobs report that shows us just how unequal the labor market is. And here it is. So wages actually went up by more than 5% in the past year. And this sounds like great news. And in normal times, it would be great news. Wages are going up for people. But in this case, it is not as good as it looks at first blush.
Yeah, exactly. Because wage growth only measures the wages of people who still have their jobs and obviously still have wages that can be measured. And right now, what high wage growth actually is showing is that people with low wages were overwhelmingly more likely to have lost their jobs and therefore lost their wages.
And what's especially sad about this right now is that right before the pandemic, the fortunes of all these different groups had been converging. Inequalities seemed to be shrinking in the labor market because the low unemployment numbers, the strong labor market, had finally started reaching groups that had been left behind in the past. And the pandemic has undone that progress.
Yeah, and it's also just a sign that so long as these inequalities persist, these inequalities that have been around for such a long time, any new recession will likely impose more suffering on those groups that have been left behind traditionally than on everybody else.